story of the Chagall theft caught my eye in the newspaper for more personal reasons as well. As I mentioned, in my academic work, I'm a student of Yiddish literature. And since this is a language that unfortunately is spoken almost exclusively by dead people, it's relatively rare that my life as a nerd converges with the news. But when I read about this theft, I thought about how many of the authors, Yiddish authors whom I admired, had their works illustrated by Chagall. These were poets who had their books illustrated by Chagall, novelists for whom he had done the covers, writers who had written children's books that he had illustrated. And I started wondering how Chagall had known these Yiddish writers. And when I looked into it, I discovered that he had met all of them during the very unusual and very little-known start of his own career. In 1919, there was a wave of pogroms across Russia in which over 100,000 people were killed. As you can probably imagine, this was so many people that it was in fact necessary to build orphanages to accommodate children who had lost their families. Chagall's first job when he was a young man was as an art teacher at one of these orphanages. And he writes about this in his memoirs, and he talks about how amazed he was by how these children, as he put it, they threw themselves at colors like wild beasts at meat. As a writer, I was very moved by this idea of art as a sort of nourishing redemption. But as I learned more about this particular orphanage, I discovered something fascinating, which is that nearly every person who taught at this particular orphanage was a major avant-garde artist or writer, and they all lived there together in faculty housing. And while they were living together, they collaborated on all kinds of projects. They worked on theater sets, and for the Yiddish theater, they wrote children's books together. They did all kinds of things together. In fact, it was sort of like an artist colony, all for the benefit of these traumatized children. This arrangement, I think, suggests in some ways a difference between Jewish and modern Western culture that becomes quite important in this context of creativity. I think in modern Western culture, we have an ideal of the artist as a kind of isolated creator, sort of a genius in a garret who's living by themselves and doesn't really, and is creating something out of nothing. But I think that what you see in the case of these other writers is something quite different, which is that you have a Jewish ideal of creativity, which is in fact creativity as a group effort, as a communal activity through time and space, where every generation is expected to add something new to commentary on ancient texts, and where the value isn't how original you are, but in a sense how unoriginal you are. And what I mean by that is how well you succeed in incorporating old materials and bringing them a new resonance and meaning. And I think that this differs in many ways from certainly modern Western culture. In Christianity, and I think in many of the traditions that grew out of it, you have the idea of a writer as an individual. I mean, that's why you have something like the Gospel according to Mark. Gospel according to Mark, Gospel according to John, you have sort of the author's name on the cover of the book. The Jewish sort of equivalent of this work of literature written in the same time period is the Talmud. The Talmud, of course, is a vast 70-volume compendium of commentaries on the Torah and on the Hebrew Bible, and ongoing conversations about it. The Talmud doesn't have an author. No one's name is on the cover. The text consists of hundreds of authors, each contributing their own stories and arguments to an ongoing discussion that in effect never ends and continues over the course of centuries. So you see how this is a very different idea of what it means to write a book. And what's interesting to me is that even in a secular context, like in this orphanage where Chagall taught, which was in fact a very modern place, which was in which it was not really considered a religious institution, this way of considering art still held its value because these artists were always working together and always looking at art as a collaborative project. One of the writers who lived with Chagall at this orphanage was very familiar to me. This was a Yiddish writer whose name was Pinchas Kahanovich. His pen name was Der Nister, which means the hidden one. Der Nister was an exceptionally brilliant and creative writer, and he was particularly familiar to me because he was one of the subjects of my doctoral dissertation. So he wasn't just familiar to me, I was actually pretty sick of him at this point. When Der Nister was a young man, he was also a teacher at this orphanage. He was a literature teacher, and he actually was Chagall's housemate at this orphanage. And what I discovered was that he was not only Chagall's housemate, not only they lived together, they also were friends. And not only were they friends, but they also were collaborators. They wrote children's books together, where Chagall was the illustrator and Dernister was the author. What happened after that, though, I think is really amazing. Chagall, as we know, became French. And now his paintings hang around in museums around the world. They're in opera houses, they're on posters in college dorm rooms, they're printed on Hallmark cards. They're actually kind of hard to avoid. Meanwhile, by 1952, nearly everyone else who had taught at this particular orphanage had been executed by Stalin, who had decided to destroy a culture by murdering Jewish writers and artists. And while we like to tell stories of the triumph of the human spirit and the way that some lost manuscript was saved or something like that, I think that we have to admit that Stalin was in fact quite successful at this. Because now almost no one has heard of any of these major talents. And when I say almost no one, I include within the Jewish community for whom these writers were writing. This is very much what happened to Dernister. He and Chagall had had very similar careers. In fact, they had, as I mentioned, they had started out as roommates. But while Chagall lived to be 97 years old, had his work recognized around the world, died in effect as a worldwide household name, Dernister died in 1950 in a Soviet prison camp, and his last novel's manuscript was lost forever. And what do I mean by lost forever? He was working on a trilogy at the time of his death. He had published two volumes of it, and the publisher was waiting for him to hand in the third. At the time of his arrest, and we know this because his wife was present when he was arrested, the Soviet secret police came to his home, and the first thing they said to him when he opened the door was that they asked him to hand over his manuscripts. And according to his wife, Dernister answered by saying, "Forgive me, gentlemen, but I did not write that book for you." And then he said, "My manuscripts remain in a safe place." Unfortunately, the book has never surfaced. It was thought that perhaps after the collapse of the Soviet Union that the archives would be, KGB archives would be opened and somebody would find this in a file somewhere. That never happened. This really is a book that was lost. And in the novel, as many of you know, I imagined a place where he might have put these books for safekeeping. In my novel, there are lost works of art and literature that are buried in the basement of a museum. But in fact, this idea of works of art and literature being buried in the basement of a museum is in fact not very far from the actual truth, because in the basement of the Museum of Modern Art in New York City, they have these children's books that were written by Dernister, illustrated by Chagall. But these books are not on display in the museum, and they're also not even available anywhere in facsimile in print. I think we like to believe that time will tell the value of an artist's work. There's this idea that someday history will pass judgment, and while something may be popular during our time that might not deserve attention, that someday history will pass judgment, and the things that really deserve our attention will sort of rise to the surface magically, and that's how canons are formed, and that's how we will know which artists really deserve our attention in the future. I have to say that I think that one of the things I've discovered in studying this group of writers and artists is that what lasts is not necessarily what's best. I think that one of the things that is evident when one studies Jewish literature, and particularly Yiddish literature, is what I will call, and I hesitate to say this, but because it's a very scary thing to say for a creative artist or creative writer, including myself, but one of the things, as I said, that's evident when one studies Jewish and Yiddish literature is what I will call the lie that is at the heart of much of Western art and culture since the time of the Romantic movement in the 1800s. And that lie is that art is ultimately redemptive, that true art, true expression, is somehow sacred and can take the place of any other sacredness in one's life, that beauty is truth and truth is beauty, and that such sacred artifacts of true expression will, because of their merits, stand the test of time. Unfortunately, the Jewish historical experience has made it quite improbable that beauty is truth. And what Jewish literature ultimately addresses most powerfully, I believe, are the limits of human creativity in offering redemption or in overcoming evil. The experience of the Yiddish writers in the Soviet Union is, I think, a very disturbing and clear example of this. We can talk a lot about the divergent fates of Chagall's and Der Nister's work. And that's something I really tried to sort of set up in the book in some ways. Some people have said that the book is less than generous to Chagall. I once had a television interview where the interviewer kept needling me and saying, "So you hate Chagall?" I'm like, "I don't hate Chagall." You know, but you don't like him. And I'm like, "I like him." But there's something that bugs you about him. And it isn't in fact true. You know, but I think that But what in effect what I wanted to set up was this dichotomy of these two artists who started out in such similar ways in their same career. I mean, they started out as roommates. Both of them had tremendous acclaim as young men. Chagall had solo gallery shows all over Western Europe by the time he was in his 30s. Der Nister had published, I think, 5 books of fiction before he turned 30. I mean, these are people who had tremendous acclaim as young men. But then what you see is the divergence of their fates and their level of fame. And we can talk about why this has happened. And one explanation for it has to do with the different media in which they worked. That Chagall, in effect, benefited by not needing to be translated. That anyone can look at a Chagall painting and in some way understand what it means without having to have someone in between to translate what he was trying to say.